So we follow Joseph down into Egypt, and in verse 36, the Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's and captain of the guard. So he's in great power in Egypt, Potiphar is, and Joseph is now a servant or a slave. So we go from this height of favor with his father to now being the brand new, fresh servant in the mix in the household of Potiphar after being one of this fresh batch of servants brought to Egypt. And thus begins this long journey yet again. He's been forsaken by his family. He could very easily say, where's God? Why didn't he protect me from this happening? I'll show him. He could have at any phase broken his covenantal loyalty to God. And yet you see chapter 39, what happens instead. I love the way it starts. Look at verse 1. And Joseph was brought down to Egypt. Now, I realize geographically we're going down into Egypt. But I love the fact that there's this symbolism of being brought down to begin chapter 39. And he's bought by Potiphar. And look at verse 2. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man.
This is important.
If you like marking your scriptures, there's a phrase that's going to keep coming up, a concept that's going to repeat, that you may consider at least noting in some way in your scriptures. And you found it there in the first line of verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph. Turn it over. Look at verse 3. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. Are you seeing the couplet? The Lord is with him. Everything that he's doing is prospering. And then in verse 3, Potiphar recognizes that. Now, look at verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy. This is when, after the Potiphar's wife experience that we're going to talk about later, we're doing a quick overview at this point. The Lord was with him as he goes into prison and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Now look at verse 23. You could mark it again. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand. Why? Because the Lord was with him. And all that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. I can't tell you how many times in my life I have pled with God for the gift of Joseph. I don't even know what else to call it. It's this ability that Joseph is showing, this Christ-like capacity to always have God with you. You hear this in the sacrament prayer every Sunday, that if we'll take his name upon us, always remember him, keep his commandments which he has given us, that we'll always have his Spirit to be with us. I don't think it's rocket science. I think that's the formula right there that God himself has given us, to always have God with us. And then whatever our situation, whether we're in the middle of a climb or in the middle of a decline in the narrative arc of our own life, as long as God is with us and as long as we're letting him prevail, it's going to be okay. It doesn't mean it's going to be fun, doesn't mean it's going to be short. It just means God's going to prosper us ultimately. And in the end, those promises are sure. So let's jump back to the beginning part of the story. We've just come into Egypt, just been bought by Potiphar, made a servant, and it doesn't seem to take very long for Potiphar to recognize that the Lord is with Joseph and he prospered all that's in his hand. So look at verse 4. And Joseph found grace in Potiphar's sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. So he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had. And then the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. I wonder, Taylor, if there's any small micro-fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant promise that through your seed shall all peoples in the earth be blessed. If we stay true to God, if we just do what we're covenantally obligated to fulfill, then God will magnify our very deeds, our actions, our words, in whatever setting we find ourselves, to the point where everyone that we associate with is going to be blessed by their association with us. If we're on the Lord's errand, if we're following the same pattern that Joseph is following here, and we can be a blessing to all the world in our little world. It's powerful. We don't have to go out and do these things globally. God's doing His work through these individual efforts. I love that perspective. Now, he is so prosperous and doing so well, he's caught the attention of Potiphar's wife. His master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." Now, in contrast to Judah's story in chapter 38, and we've already talked about this, but in this context, how easy would it have been for Joseph to rationalize that behavior and to justify breaking those covenantal obligations that he has with God, those commandments to stay true and faithful. Nobody would have known, right? And she's the one who's instigating this, right? And you could come up with a long list of rationalizations. But I love his response. Look at verse 9. "There is none greater in this house than I. Neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And it came to pass, as she spake to Joseph day by day, that he hearkened not unto her to lie with her, or to be with her. Isn't that fascinating? This
It's
add-on,
not just once.
she has been trying over time, and how the devil does this to us. If you don't fall to the temptation today, that's okay. He seems to be pretty patient. He'll try again tomorrow, and then the next day, and then the next day, and next week, and he's going to keep trying different angles until he can find that weak spot or that weak moment. And so then on this particular day, he's in the house, and none of the men of the house were within. Verse 12, she caught him by his garment. Now, we use that word today differently than they did back then. It would just be his item of clothing here, his outer cloak probably. She caught him by his garment, and she said, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. I love this idea that he runs away. He fled. Sometimes the greatest victories are won by retreating, by running away. That's the greatest victory that we can have. And that's what's happening here in the story. So she holds on to that. Then her husband comes home, and she tells him, verse 17, she spake unto him according to these words, saying, "The Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came in unto me to mock me." And she lifted up her voice and said, "See, and here's the proof. I've got his garment." Now, I could be completely wrong, and it won't bother me in the least if someday in the future I find out that I was totally wrong on this. But here's my own thinking, my own assumption. I'm assuming that if you have a slave, a servant, and he's accused of what Joseph is accused of, that in that time in Egypt, you wouldn't throw him in prison. You'd kill him. You'd be done with him. He doesn't deserve to live if he's really tried to do this. So my own belief is that Joseph has so much integrity so much goodness, not to mention so much divine protection that he can't be killed because his mission is not fulfilled. But I think in my own mind that Potiphar has recognized Joseph's integrity and goodness. And maybe Potiphar knows his wife's tendencies, and maybe to save face in the public, he has to do something. So he sends Joseph to prison. But in my mind, I could be wrong, but I think Potiphar knows that Joseph is not guilty of what he's being commanded or what he's being charged with. Not terribly unlike Pilate at the time of Christ, who Pilate recognizes I find no fault in this man. He's innocent. But the people are crying for Jesus to be crucified, and so to save face and to prevent an insurrection, he allows terrible things to be done to Jesus. I wonder if there's some symbolic crossover there. So he's thrown into prison, and then in verse 20 it says, Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph. Did you notice the first word in verse 21? He was thrown into prison for doing the right thing. He had chosen the best part, and because of it, because of the world in which we live, he is now going to be punished. So if you've ever done something really good and had bad consequences occur to you for having done the right, you're in pretty good company in those situations.